We got a problem with online politics. We got a big problem, particularly on the people who are center left to left. We have a major problem. Okay, center right, I guess you could say that, but you've got bigger problems on levels of the soul when it comes to your movement right now than ours. Now, right-wing podcasts dominate the podcasting space. If you go look at the top podcasts in the country, there's not a lot of left-leaning, if you could even say that, of anything near the top podcasts up there. You got Joe Rogan up there, interviewing Donald Trump, having much more, to be frank, conservative guests on than left-wing guests. And when they do have left-wing guests, it's a question of, well, are they left-wing? They do have like Kyle Kalinske, that show was good, but those shows are becoming less and less. And shows without those types of people are becoming more and more. And so while I wouldn't call Joe Rogan a right-wing podcaster, you can call him a center to center-right guy who tends to bring on right-wing guys to speak to that audience. Not only right-wing guys, people of all stripes, but largely speaking, when it comes to political persuasion and politicians, political people, it's people on the right. And if you look at all of the other top podcasts, whether I know, like, definitely if you go to the political ones, Dan Bongino's show or Ben Shapiro's, the vast majority of them are right-wing. There are some left-wing podcasts. I know I know Chapo existed, but I don't even know if Chapo is still a thing. And I don't know how accessible Chapo is, honestly. There's a few others, but none of the, honestly, I don't even know if Chapo is, mentioning Chapo and Joe Rogan in the same sentence feels almost silly because of just the difference in scale and influence. When you go onto YouTube and you look at the political YouTubers, the ones that are churning out the content constantly are the ones on the right. The ones with the media companies backing them and assisting them in churning this out, they're largely on the right. There's a few left-wing content creators or center-left content creators. Brian Tyler Cohen is one I could note. Of course, there's people like David Pakman. There's people like Sam Cedar. There's voices out there. They can be center-left, to left, or further. And of course, if you get to people like Hassan Piker, who's pretty big on Twitch and on YouTube, they exist as well. But when you stack it up, person to person, media empire to media empire, PBD podcast versus Sam Cedar's show, Tim Pool podcast versus David Pakman. When you go bar to bar, line to line, the right just ends up getting more viewers. The right just ends up getting bigger advertisers. The right ends up getting more media institutional backing on the general than the left. Not saying they don't get it all. There was blue money this last race, but not to the same extent as is the cooperation between right-wing congressional campaigns, right-wing political movements, particularly the MAGA movement, these podcasts, coordinating appearances, and the money that they get straight up from the Reds, as in red money, not necessarily RNC direct money, but RNC affiliated money. And of course, money from very wealthy right-wing businessmen. That's, again, not to say that the left doesn't get any of it, just saying that when you go bar for bar, they're getting much, 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 much more. So, more viewership, a lot of times bigger guests. Definitely, I mean, Donald Trump's a big guest. And more resources, just generally speaking. Whether it has to do with booking or sets or money, the right is dominating in all these areas. And I can't think of any area where the left dominates outside of maybe short form content. And even then, I don't know how long that will last. I think on TikTok, the left might dominate a little bit more, but the right has made a home for themselves there as well. YouTube Shorts? Is there a political community in YouTube Shorts? I've not seen it. I've mostly seen, just like edits from Mr. In Between and Breaking Bad and different TV shows that They're like, what's the worst way to consume this? In 30-second chunks with music blaring over it, cutting out all of the filler? Yeah, that's the worst way to consume a movie. And that's exactly what we're going to feed you. YouTube Shorts. A way to waterboard yourself digitally. Irish Space Potato Farmer, thank you so much for the tier 1 sub. I appreciate that. Point is, let me boil it down. They got more money. They got more viewership. They got more institutional support. And they got more resources generally. On every single front I can think of, right-wing podcasters and content creators are dominating more so. And now they're getting so much money. It's even coming from overseas. Tenet Media, come on. They got so many ventures and so much stuff being thrown at them that when this funny businessman that doesn't exist and you can't Google starts offering you hundreds of thousands of dollars for you to just them to re-upload your stuff on their show, my goodness, you don't ask any questions. There must be a lot of money floating around. Point is, the left is getting clocked in all of these areas. Now, I don't know how much necessarily I want to infuse more institutional support, as in we're going to have DNC podcasts here, DNC podcasts there. I think cooperation's good. I don't know how much they should do and how much they should concentrate on it. And if they do, what that's going to end up looking like, how authentic it's going to look like versus inauthentic. I don't know how much that matters. I think it matters. But then I see the type of viewership Benny Johnson gets, and then immediately my mentality about this is shattered. So they're dominating in all of these areas, most of which we would want to dominate in as people who are in the center left to left. I'm making it a broader spectrum, and that has to do with my first problem, the spectrum on the left. The left are constantly fighting. This is nothing new. There's nothing new with the left fighting each other. But the things that are being fought over when you talk about like 2020 compared to now in that time period. Oh.
My dad gets his news from conservative YouTube shorts. It's frustrating and horrible.
YouTube short conservative content. It sounds like waterboarding. It sounds like waterboarding to me. It should not be allowed at Guantanamo Bay, and it should not be allowed, period. So here's the first problem that I think the left is running into. And that problem has to do with, I think, relatability. Relatability to, and this is something that I think we could possibly dominate the right on if we got the right people. The voice, this isn't a question of just taking existing voices and re-amplifying them and just getting them larger and bigger. If we just make Brian Tyler Cohen loud enough, if we just make Hassan Piker loud enough, if we just make anybody that's vaguely considered left-wing in the United States louder, then that'll win. And that's what I fear we're going to do, is that they're going to just go to the existing content creators, blast them up, try to partner them with campaigns, and then we're not going to be accessing any new people. We're not going to be, we might be accessing new canvassers, we might be accessing new donations, but we're not going to be accessing new people into the movement, or we're not going to be bringing people in that we haven't already had in. I think the first thing is if we're going to, or the institutions, or, you know, the Democratic Party, or the left as a general concept, wants to get more people within its movement, it cannot just rely on the voices that exist in the space. I'm sorry to say this, but I cannot speak to the issues of Midwestern farmers. I cannot speak to the issues of Texans or Californians or any of these people that I don't share that background with. That doesn't mean we won't have issues that overlap. Housing prices. Something affects me, it affects everybody in this country, it seems. So that's something that would, broadly speaking, be, you know, across lines that we could all kind of relate to. But if you want to get groups that don't align with you politically, or you want to introduce them into either, if not joining the labor movement, at least possibly voting in a way that could be beneficial for progressing the United States on climate issues, on labor rights, on any number of issues that I think we all believe, at least for most of the people watching this video, are important, you're going to have to start podcasts or start shows or integrate shows that speak to communities that we're not speaking to currently. And that means having shows that speak to farmers about right to repair and how Democrats want to pass legislation on right to repair. Assuming that the Democrats would actually prioritize such a thing to go for a demographic that it traditionally sees as kind of lost. You would need to have shows that could speak to that and speak to it with authority. Somebody with a farmer's background that could speak the language of farmers, that could talk about their margins, talk about what happens when tariffs are imposed on the imported goods that they need to farm, and what those retaliatory tariffs could mean to them. Because if you had somebody that could speak their language, speak the way they speak, and tell them about these issues, that might have a real impact on how they view the political landscape. That could have a real impact on how they view the incoming administration, their tariff policy, right to repair laws, any number of things. And that means speaking to them from the community. Farmers is one example. Let's use a different example. Young men. There's a huge crisis right now with young men, where young men, I guess men of my age, are not joining the left, quote unquote, in the rates that they would have been considered to historically, or let's say a few years ago. That there's been a rightward shift amongst young men. We're South Korea now. Now, how did we get here? Well, I think one problem is that the issues that young men care about cannot be attended to through the identity prism. At least it can in some instances. You know, if you're a young black man, then you could talk to them about police, police brutality, or you could talk to them about discrimination in relation to their race and how it affects employment and stuff like that. But when you're talking about, for example, marijuana legalization, when you're talking about, for example, trying to make it so first-time home buyers can buy a home for the first time, which when you talk about young men going into the housing market, trying to find out what a mortgage even is, that can be quite helpful. When you're talking about people who, just like every other age bracket, are still trying to pay groceries with grocery prices that have increased. We're talking about people who are dealing with high amounts of student debt, medical debt, credit card debt, and just different types of debt. Debt-heavy society right now. We have a debt crisis in this country. Talking to people about jobs, good-paying jobs out of college. So we're talking about, good trades jobs, good trade opportunity, trade school opportunities. Like, if you want to speak to these people about any of these issues that could potentially matter to them as a young man, trade school, marijuana legalization, high amounts of debt, whether it be credit card debt, student debt, any of these issues, you need to speak to them where they are and how they are. Where they are and how they are. So that means first, where are they listening to this content? YouTube. Where are they listening to opinions about people, opinions about the politics in the world? YouTube, TikTok, YouTube Shorts, maybe Twitch. You could probably throw Twitch in there, but Twitch to some extent. Kick, maybe. Maybe you could throw in Kick. Cable TV, barely at all. Barely at all. And of course, there's social media platforms. Instagram is a big one. Twitter is another one. Facebook, less so. That's for an older age bracket, but young people also do use Facebook. You need to go to them where they are here. So this already discounts traditional media. This discounts CNN. This discounts MSNBC. They can repost their stuff online, but it will not be given the same authentic respect as other YouTube shows that are more independent, where somebody's talking more off the cuff, more informally with you. And so I don't think it can communicate to them in the authentic way that they probably desire. And it's going to be I'm going to be blunt, like establishment, and not speaking to them in the way that they speak in their language. So the first thing is you need to be where they are. So not cable news, online. So that's the first thing. We've achieved that. We're online. Hassan's online. I'm online. All you guys are online. So we've achieved that part. Okay. Part 2, how they are. You need to talk to them in their language. So not the language of the urban socialite trying to show that they're a good person by talking about diversity and inclusion. Not because diversity is bad, not because inclusion is bad, but it's not a selling point for most people on a campaign, and it's not the language that these people speak on a day-to-day. When you're speaking with your bros, you don't go to your bros and start dropping buzzwords about, equity and inclusion and diversity. And these are not like buzzwords you're dropping around. You're talking with your buddies. And I'm not saying that these things can't be important at all, but my view of it is when you talk about things like DEI and you talk about things like critical race theory, this is stuff left to academics. This is not stuff that should be on the campaign trail. This is not stuff that should be just casually like, oh, hey, let me talk to you guys about. Thankfully, the critical race theory stuff, I think, is largely conjured up, and it's not something that Democrats are campaigning on. It's not something they campaign on at all. But when we talk about like identity politics, leaning into Black, Latino, we want the Black and Latino, we want the diversity and equity and the inclusion. When you're leaning into that publicly, I think a lot of times it's being read as not that you're hostile to these groups and this is like a deceptive action, but that it's pandering. And then you combine that with urban socialite language, and you're talking to an academic, you're not talking to a voter, and you're certainly not talking to a young man who wants something to them, who wants, it blunt, authentic, and in their language. And that is not the language of the academic or of the socialite. That is the language of, slang from their generation. That's the language of, of the internet, of the information age. Okay? We're not going to be going with black and white filters on TV, smoking cigarettes to the bud. I mean, to the filter, just listing off the, economic data. Or a new age, multicolored rainbows of just speaking in the language of like textbook revolutionaries and equity, inclusion, and college campus HR people. And I'm sorry if this feels like a vague, like I'm casting wide nets here, very wide nets. But I don't think that this type of messaging is going to work. I don't think it's going to work. I'm not the first one to say it's not going to work. And so I think you need to speak to them about issues that matter to them. And the best way to do it is to have people who care about the issues instead of people who were talking like that 5 minutes ago, but have now switched to this. It's going to come off as very inauthentic. So you're going to have to go to people who speak their language, speak their slang, speak bluntly to them, are already where they are, or could be where they are, if you're building it from scratch.
Mr. Machno has donated $5. The Adam Friedland Show is unironically center-left Joe Rogan. Neil deGrasse Tyson and other celebrities went on it and it went over well.
That's true. They've got like dog doo-doo, like foreign policy, but that is true. That's like an example. I feel that this election has clearly shown that just leaning into identity is not only not enough, it might be detrimental if you could have been using that time to talk about more important economic issues that matter on the daily basis to people, much more. The fact that I honestly got more messaging about Harris's background and the historic nature of her presidency rather than marijuana legalization and the historic nature of what that would mean for black and brown communities, but all communities as well, that's a problem. Waiting till the buzzer to announce those policies, that's a problem. I mean, really, what do you think is gonna sell more people on a Harris presidency? And I know this, we're kind of pivoting away back to the Harris presidency, but they lost Latino men. You're running against Donald Trump, the build the wall guy, and you lost Latino men. That's a complete failure of identity politics. On its face, it's fallen over. Electorally. You want to keep it in the academic circles, keep it in the academic circles. You want to keep it in the, you want to keep studying it, you want to keep studying it, fantastic. You want to keep it in the socialite circles and New York City and you know, high-rise clubs in Baltimore or wherever, fantastic, go do that. But when we're on the campaign trail and when we're talking to people who are not already convinced of what you believe, you've got to concentrate on the issues that matter to them. Not that talking about all this stuff has really got us much anyway. Not saying that talking about diversity as a concept hasn't gotten us anything. I just don't see what taking the other side here on, for example, affirmative action, or taking the other side strong on DEI has gotten us electorally. And if it's gotten us nothing electorally, even if you stand by it, it should be something that's in the back room. It should be in the back room, behind boxes, behind cabinet shelves, hoisted away for us not to look at it. It's terrible messaging. So that's the first thing. Identity politics, cut it out. Cut it out, cut it out, cut it out. Both of, and I'm not saying that there can be none, but it's the type of thing where you say, being the first Latino president would be great. Now here's 59 minutes of policy. And I'm not trying to say this to be mean about the historic nature of a first female president. It's just if we don't convince people that the first female president should actually be president, then you will never have a first female president. Back to the online space, because this equally applies to here and going to these spaces and try to talk to them. Because when you have these like disinformation researchers and like people who research like hate groups and stuff like that, and they get passionate when they go out and speak to these people, don't speak in the language of academics, speak in the language of everyday people. Try to, if you want to take academic language and translate it to everyday people, number one, it should be on an issue that actually that will matter to them or they will care about. And two, you got to make it in language that they can understand. And bring it to the locations where they will hear it. You just play it on an ad on TV that they're not watching, it's not going to have an impact, and then you're just wasting money on ad buys. Okay, back to the online space. That's the first thing. That needs to be cut out of the general dialogue when you're approaching these spaces. And it's just not a good strategy. Number one. Number two, and I think this would really help, and this is an advantage that we could have over the people that we're talking to. Specialize. Specialize, specialize, specialize. You don't need to be, this is for existing people and future people, you don't need to be an expert in everything. You don't need to be an expert in everything. Build a network. Have people who know stuff about Israel-Palestine. Have people who know stuff about serving in the armed forces. Have people who know stuff about Ukraine, who know stuff about housing policy, who know stuff about drug policy, who know stuff about crisis response and crisis management, and have those people on call. And instead of you, as the news is coming in, 24 hours news cycle, as you're covering everything, trying to become an expert in everything, concentrate on one area that you could really get to know well, have a general surface level knowledge and everything else. But then if you want to talk in depth about something, you're going to start shooting off the hip, call somebody else in to either check you or go say the thing for you. Not because you need to puppet them, but because you don't want to go out there and start doing weapons identification over, like, by the ear and start discrediting yourself in front of people. And start discrediting yourself in front of your audience, in front of potential viewers, and discrediting your cause. Because when people see that and they see you as an advocate for a cause, getting things wrong like that, they translate that to your cause doesn't know anything, your cause is uninformed, you're just one more example of an uninformed buffoon talking about something you don't know anything about. So that's my next piece of advice. Don't specialize in everything, specialize in something, and then engage in, what would we call it? Ideas trade, right? If I'm going to talk about economic policy, bring on an economist. If I want to talk about racing, bring on a car racer. If I want to talk about boxing, bring on a boxer. It's not that complicated. It's not that hard. It also helps you build up a network. It's also what mainstream news channels have been doing forever. And not everything that mainstream news channels have done do we have to reject because we're alternative news. Some of them did it because they're competent media organizations and they know what they're doing, and they can't get away with it in the same way we can when we mess up. When we mess up, you know who we hold ourselves accountable to? Ourselves. And if the internet doesn't forget, the internet might make us remember. But in large part, it's ourselves. Ourselves. And for that reason, I think holding ourselves to a higher standard could help build more credibility, and it could be an advantage over the people that we're going head to head with. Because Benny Johnson doesn't have that credibility. Joe Rogan shot it quite a while ago. There's a few others who have too. And if you can have that credibility, that's not, oh, that's something we can do to catch up with the right. That's something we can do to stay ahead of the right. That's something we can do to stay ahead of the competition. It's also good ethically. It also breeds a better information space. When you have a better information space and you're dealing less with fiction and you're dealing more with fact and you're dealing more with grounded conversations instead of stuff out in the ether, talking about God knows what and stuff that people don't care about or stuff that could never be implemented because you're in la la land. When you have a grounded conversation, not only could that have, not only is that better in bringing people down back to earth, to allowing them to engage with politics in reality, but you also have a much better opportunity in informing people about actual policy implementation, about things that could actually be passed, instead of problem 3. And problem 3 is, stop talking about bullshit. Stop talking about nonsense. Stop talking about things that nobody cares about. Oh my God, nobody cares about fucking Wizards of Waverly Place, Hogwarts, like whether or not playing the game is like technically who cares? Nobody cares. I don't care. No one cares. Only you and your small subset of people who already agree with you, who will always agree with you. Only those people care. Only those people care. Nobody else cares. Nobody else cares. I don't care. Your neighbor doesn't care. The other neighbor to the other side of you doesn't care. The vast majority of people do not care. The vast majority of a lot of these small intersquabbles between different content creators is just nothing but interpersonal bullshit or purity testing. And when you look at something online, you need to take these two things. Is it interpersonal bullshit or is it purity testing? Because if you've built your audience, if you've built your empire on interpersonal bullshit, then you're always going to need interpersonal bullshit. You're going to need to be like Chud Logic 24/7. And I'm not saying being Chud Logic bad. I'm just saying Chud Logic is not a primary political streamer. He's a drama streamer. And so we're no longer talking about politics streaming. We're talking about drama streaming. So that's the first thing. And the second one, I said it was the interpersonal bullshit or purity testing. Our movement is not gigantic. We do not make up the majority of Americans. And if you are, and I'm going to throw this out for a particular subsect of the population, if you are a socialist, an American socialist, you are a very small percentage of the overall population. Now, you can bust out whatever number you want to say, well, if I propose this policy, these amount of Americans would agree with it, and these amount of Americans would agree with it. On your ideological composition as a whole, you make up a small percentage of Americans. And when people vote in administrations, it's not like, oh, I'm going to choose this policy and that policy. It's with the whole administration. And so even if the majority of Americans liked those policies, I don't even know if those policies are going to get implemented. And plus, a lot of these polls are being talked about in the way where you phrase it in a positive way, you get a positive response. And even if the ones that you do phrase it in a neutral way and you still get a positive response, if you throw more information out there, you might get a completely contradictory response. Something along the lines of, should we increase spending on the military massively? 80% says yes. Should we increase taxes to make up for it? 80% says no. And you'll get stuff like that on healthcare. I want universal, single-payer healthcare. And then, next question is, do you believe there should still be a private option? And then it messes around. It jostles around. Point is, I don't want to get to the specifics. I agree that there's certain left-wing policies that are widely popular and probably not going to be implemented for a while due to institutional opposition that the left can move itself forward in advocating for because it's popular. But we seem to always focus on the stuff that is not popular. We always seem to focus on let's see if we can justify this guy burning down his local CVS. Let's see if we can find a way to justify these people flash mobbing this little corner store and stealing $500 to $800 worth of perfume from this grocery store to feed his family. And then the justifications get silly. They get stupid. And even if you can find a way, because like starving person steals bread to survive, it's pretty okay. 1-to-1 makes sense. Gang of 10 people clean out store of iPhones. Well, actually, when you think, no. Not only are you not going to convince anyone, you're going to make your movement look like it's full of thugs. You're going to make it look like you're actually pro-crime. And it's all happening while Americans are quite fearful about criminal activity in the country. That doesn't mean violent crime isn't coming down, but that doesn't change American perceptions. And perception is everything. Perception is truth to these people. It might not be physical truth. It might not be material truth. But if you get mugged in an alleyway, somebody telling you the crime rate went down 30% isn't going to matter all that much to you on a personal level. It's the same problem the Harris campaign had on the campaign trail, trying to brag about positive economic indicators, trying to brag about GDP increases, trying to brag about being the best performing country out of all the G7 countries post COVID, trying to brag about, unemployment rates, bringing down the inflation. But when you challenge that with personal, like high amounts of debt, whether medical, educational, or credit card, maybe it doesn't match up. And then you feel like that person is rejecting your experience. Or even worse, endorsing, in the case of the crime, endorsing your victimization. Or your community's victimization. Because I'm going to be honest, when most people see those videos, they get this like personal like feeling of rage or of injustice. Like something has been done wrong to someone. Like this person who started a store or is trying to manage a store on a, whatever day, now has to deal with all these people coming in and stealing inventory. And we've taken time out of our day to justify that. Look, if it's a fringe podcast, I would say, okay, it's whatever. It's a fringe podcast. It's the largest political streamer on the platform. It's the largest political streamer on the platform. And I don't think there's not a place for content creators like Hassan. I don't think there's, and if he wants to be as large as he is now, fantastic. Good for him. He gets to make all the money in the world. But there has to be other options. There has to be other options so that when somebody comes to the left, their options isn't giant horse schlong guy or fucking looting and burn it down dude. Like I that should not. It needs to be a wider selection. It needs to be. There needs to be people who are going to more accurately or more authentically talk to those people's personal struggles. Connor Eats Pants can be the next best thing. I mean, I think Connor Eats Pants is really good at talking to people. I think I've seen his stuff. I think it's really good. I think this is an example of like, the space doing well. This is a non-politics streamer doing politics surprisingly well due to the position he's in, and the people he can keep getting off of these interviews. It's really good. I like it. But the point is, like, we need a wider selection of people talking about topics that matter. Topics that, impact the kitchen table. Topics that will end up affecting how much money they have to pay their bills, how much they'll be able to afford for college, how much, whether or not their kids are going to be able to go to college, the healthcare cost. Like, these are the things that should be the primary focuses. And I understand that just by only focusing on this in the online space, especially when there's juicier drama topics to munch on, is difficult, but it is necessary. It doesn't need to be the only thing you focus on, but you need, even if you're going to have the drama and you're going to have the other stuff to drag people in, which I understand, you need to have that stuff in between to drag in the people that otherwise would not be there. And if you're not going to, you need to at least acknowledge that there has to be a place for these people And they have to have a voice. They have to be able to be found. If they're just like 5 or 10 or 15 viewer Andys, then they're not going to show up on Twitch. They're not going to show up in the algorithm. And how much impact are they having really? And I'm not being mean. They can still have an impact in their tiny little communities. But we want these voices to reach out to people who are not hearing them and give them an alternative perspective than the reason you have it tough at your job is because all these fucking migrants came in and they were so busy raping and stealing jobs that they stumbled into yours, you know? And you need to be there. You need to have somebody in these places where these people already are. They can speak to their experience. They speak to issues that really concerns them. They'd be like, no. Let's talk about that unionization at your workplace and what that deal your union negotiated. Or no. Let's talk about the problem with a lack of overtime pay at your workplace. And talk about et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This comes, though, with lived experience. This comes from just being born in a certain neighborhoods that give you certain opportunities that only you will be able to relate to because you were born there just as they were, and Hassan wasn't, I wasn't, Charlie wasn't, other people weren't. And I do not think that Hassan or Vosh or Destiny or any of these people speak to the subsets that we haven't been reaching. I think, Destiny has been able to make some inroads. He's able to make some progress. Vosh, I think Vosh is largely working with a base that's already here. Hassan, same thing. It might just be due to the flavor of their political persuasion. I know they convince some people sometimes, new people to come over. But in my experience, I think, and when I say my experience, of course, it's very limited. I think that there are certain people, just due to the way that Destiny comes off, due to the way that Hassan comes off, and the way that Vosh comes off, they will just never, ever appeal to them. They acknowledge, all these content creators, that entertainment is a huge part of this. And if you're not entertaining to those people, it's going to be hard to drag them in. And if your personality is not something they can relate to, it's going to be even harder to drag them in. And so this is not something that could be simply solved by, pumping up Hassan another 300,000 viewership or Destiny or Vosh. Of course, like them, some of these creators increasing in viewership could be helpful. This is something that can only be done by expanding the network, building up new creators with perspectives that are not often shown in our spaces, and having open conversations about the topics that matter to them. You know what it's also going to take? And this might be difficult for some of us to reckon with. It's going to have to take more collaboration between members of the space. Everybody's involved in bunker arcs right now. And if you're not involved in bunker arcs, you're not engaging with people that disagree with you. And for me, if you want to reach people, if you want to solve this issue, you got to go to where they are. You got to go to where the people are. You got to go on to Tim Pool's podcast like Sam Cedar did. You've got to go onto these different shows. You got to go into the new norm as an animated character. Convince him. No. You got to go onto these shows where you're not always going to be welcome, or onto shows that typically would not have your perspective. It doesn't need to be a hostile environment necessarily every time. It doesn't need to be. But when people are going to watch Tim Pool, there are people trying to discover themselves politically the same way you did way back in the day whenever you found out what you were politically. Before that, when you were just playing Gary's mod and stuffing down on ice cream sandwiches, whatever you were doing. Before that time, at a certain point, you went out and you formed a political consensus, a political idea, something political. And those people are finding Tim Pool, they're finding Steven Crowder, they're finding Benny Johnson, and I think it'd be better if we were there when that happened. Or that when it did happen and they Googled their names, maybe they could find something countering it. And it doesn't need to, you don't need to hold my extreme position on this, that you have to go talk to people you disagree with. Oh no, it's so difficult for you. I'm very sorry. You don't need to hold that position. You could just be of the thought, okay, well, let's go into environments that we're not traditionally going to be. I'm trying to think of a good example to use here. But I mean, maybe like sports podcasts. Like we saw how, oh God, what's his name? Stephen A. Smith, he starts going on political shows and he's killing it. He is dogging it. And like sports podcasts might not always have the best, how you say, topic list to immediately go into, topics of unionization, but you can find unique ways. And if not you going into the spread that space, you're talking to the people there who are on those shows about unionizing players and unionized workforces for different like businesses. I mean, in wrestling, it is pretty notorious the fact that Hulk Hogan undercut a wrestlers union. And when you go in there and you can tell that story from the wrestler's perspective, if I go into a wrestling conversation, I can talk about that. I could talk about how these union contracts could have helped give these wrestlers who put their bodies on the line for our storytelling, for our wrestling, for our sport, they're not getting protected well. And if we had stuff like the PRO Act, it would be easier to et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And some of this is going to be talks that we're not going to be directly even able to involve ourselves in. And so it's going to be a question of trying to get it there through diffusion or talking to the people on these shows and what do you call it? Blue pilling them? Whatever you want to go. Blue pill, red pill, green pill, purple pill, whatever pill you want to give them. But you need to make that effort to go into the environments where you're not always welcome, but you're not always seen. So you can make those perspectives seen. By the way, can I question the Hassan representation of masculinity as his ability to like access young men and go out there and grab them, drag them in? He's masculine in what way? He's a big guy and he's got muscles, right? But besides that, and I don't mean, again, this is not supposed to be the Hassan hate fest. It's become a little bit of this. But what's manly about Hassan? Because I hear about this, like, or manly or ability to, like, relate to these young men. I'm sure there's, like, certain slang terminology and there's certain ways he can communicate with certain sections of the population. But, like, what coast? West Coast, LA area? Like, that lingo, that style of dress? Because when I think of men, and, like, how I grew up in my family, like, the interests that I had were things like fishing. Men in my family hunted. We a baseball game, maybe? I don't know. Football. We'd sit around, couch, watch football together. These are not the aesthetics that Hassan puts off. Hassan puts off a certain type of masculine aesthetic. He's a certain type of masculine. And so when we talk about like trying to get to young men, like the young men we're not reaching, I don't know if it's the young men that Hassan necessarily can reach. I think maybe there's a question of mobilization and him being able to mobilize people more if he tries to, if he puts his thumb on it. But when it comes to like reaching young men, I don't like, it's hard, it's weird to say this with like a personality, but has Hassan reached like the cap? Because I don't think he's winning over the fishermen. I don't think he's winning over the longshoremen. I don't think he's winning over like the typical construction worker. And I'm not saying that he hasn't won over any of them. I'm just talking about broad strokes. How can he relate to them? How can he bring them a conversation and a back and forth that they can be like, yeah, man, I relate to that. Oh, that's very authentic. Yeah, I've had the same experience. And I'm not saying I can either. Well, maybe the fishermen. But I certainly can't do that for construction workers. Maybe my father could have, but I couldn't. I guess my general point is that we need to generally increase the amount of streamers, make sure they're coming from diverse perspectives, so we're not just making clones that's all just within the orbit. In fact, I would even make the radical statement that some people need to leave some orbits and try to go to greener pastures. And these new streamers then need to be supported through a network that allows us to rely on each other's strengths instead of always having to expose our weaknesses by being experts on everything. Tim Waltz should become a Twitch streamer. That is an idea that you have proposed in my chat. I don't know what more you want me to say to that, but that is an idea that you have proposed in my chat.